How do we make sense of inequality at the global level? How has globalization caused global inequality? How do war and terrorism further exacerbate global violence, conflict, harm, and inequality? On this episode of Social Problems, we're talking all about global inequality, war, and terrorism. Sit back, grab a snack, and let's get to it. My name is Dr. Derek Silva, and I'm an associate professor of criminology studying harm and injustice in the social world. On today's episode of Social Problems, we're talking about inequality on the global scale and the impact of war and terrorism on global inequality. There are two videos uploaded today, this one and another separate video that introduces students to the field of sociology of terrorism. So when you're done with this video, please head over to the Topic 7 page on OWL and watch the other video. For those interested, I teach a third-year seminar on the sociology of terrorism at King's. The course code for that class is 3363, and we cover a number of topics related to terrorism, including policing, law, surveillance, mass media, algorithmic social control, right-wing extremism and incel-inspired violence, and the rise of conspiracy theories in relevant groups like QAnon. So if this topic is of interest for you, I urge you to consider taking that seminar. This week's chapter introduces the topics of war and terrorism and emphasizes how conflicts are constructed as part of a larger social process. In other words, how conflicts can be understood as social constructions rather than natural byproducts of an inevitable force. There is no doubt that we live in a highly globalized world, and this globalization has led to a number of large and small scale conflicts inside nation states, amongst different nations, and even between nations through other third parties. We'll return to this last one later, but this is what scholars call proxy wars. Globalization refers to the integration of a world scale of economic activities and peoples by units of private capital and improved communications, technology, and transportation. In other words, globalization is the trend of increasing interdependence among the economies and societies of the world. It is the increased interconnectedness of the world in almost every sense. Think about it. It is a relatively recent development that one could travel across the globe in a single day. Really only in the past 30 years that we've been able to send instant communications reliably to almost anyone in the world. We do need to understand that global communication is not an equitable thing, and a number of folks do not have the communication abilities that we think are quote unquote normal. But the point here is that we live in a highly connected global universe in all respects, financially, in our communications, in our food chain, our health systems, and so on. Globalization has undoubtedly led to massive evolution in terms of technology and human development. But it has also led to a number of large-scale conflicts that must be explored. Throughout the lecture, we will draw attention to the role that the state or nation states can and do play in warfare and global conflicts, pointing out that centralized states are more likely to be engaged in conflict than what are called decentralized states. The terms centralization and decentralization refer to the political and administrative structure of a nation state or country. In a centralized state, the power and authority are concentrated in the hands of the central government, which makes decisions and performs most functions. Conversely, in a decentralized state, power and responsibilities are dispersed and distributed across regions and areas. In a centralized state, the decision-making process becomes the responsibility of a small group of people and is in the hands of a central government. Some call this style of government an oligarchy because very few people hold the decision-making power in the state. Conversely, a decentralized state seeks the participation of local authorities and government entities, Canada and the United States are decentralized states that decide on policy issues and collectively binding decisions through participation with multiple stakeholders. Let's be clear here, however, that the difference between centralized and decentralized government is not a mutually exclusive dichotomy. In other words, they are not completely separate archetypes that a country must fit perfectly into only one category. In fact, the difference between centralized and decentralized states is much more of a continuum. Some are closer to decentralized, and yet decision making power is in practice in the hands of very few people. The United States is actually a pretty good example of this. More centralized states tend to have more conflict because various groups with different motives and objectives tend to grasp for decision making power that only one or few other groups possess. In decentralized states, power is more or less equitably distributed, and thus many groups govern collectively through consensus and negotiation. As our social history lessons illustrate, strong ideology of almost any kind, such as religion or devotion to economic theories like capitalism or socialism, can contribute towards a nation's involvement in conflict. Ideology can perhaps best be understood as a system of beliefs that explains how a society is or should be. It's any system of ideas underlying and informing political action. In a Marxist sense, ideological ideas justify and legitimize subordination of one group to another group, and ideology is thus a political project that is embedded in power relations. A number of empirical projects have consistently found that strong ideology is often associated with increased tension that may lead to conflict. This is particularly the case in jurisdictions and contexts where there exist strong conflicting ideologies, such as the conflicts we see between neoliberal democracies like Canada, the UK, and the US, and non-liberal democracies like China, Venezuela, or Iran. Or within countries that have a number of conflicting strong ideologies, like the increased political polarization in the US, or in countries where different religious sects conflict with one another, like Pakistan, Palestine, or Syria. For your read, watch, and respond, please answer the following question. How do structures of the state, i.e. decentralized versus centralized government, help determine the likelihood a country will engage in conflict and/or warfare? Please name some examples that you can think of that are not talked about in this video. One of the most influential theoretical models for understanding global development in a heavily globalized world is sociologist and economist Immanuel Wallerstein's world systems theory, which seeks to explain the uneven pace of development in the world by looking at unequal relations between different countries. Wallerstein, influenced by Karl Marx, developed his approach to world systems theory in the 1960s and 1970s, first at Columbia and then at McGill. According to Wallerstein, the modern nation state exists within a broad economic, political, and legal framework which he calls a world system. Just as individual behavior cannot be understood without reference to the socio-cultural system in which they are members, which we have covered at length in this class, individual societies or nation states cannot be understood without reference to the world system in which they are embedded and exist. Modern nation states are part of the world system of advanced capitalism, and it is this world system that Wallerstein seeks to understand empirically. According to Wallerstein, the capitalist world system began in Europe in the 16th century as powerful areas moved from feudal societies towards economies based on the accumulation of capital. In the process of this expansion, the capitalist world system absorbed all other types of smaller economic systems and so-called world empires and economies to create a singular mode of production and consumption. As globalization through the world increased, the capitalist world economy was created by establishing long-distance trade in goods and linking production of processes worldwide, all of which allowed for the significant accumulation of capital to be centralized in Europe and European powers who were colonizing the rest of the world. Importantly, colonization that was itself a top-down hierarchical power relation that subjugated folks in colonies to horrifying conditions of murder and physical and sexual violence at the hand of colonizers from Europe. But these economic relationships were not created in a vacuum. The modern idea of the nation state that we now think is natural was itself created in Europe by the 1648 Treaty of Westphalia, along with capitalism, to serve and to protect the interests of the capitalist and colonizers. What was in the interest of early European capitalists and colonizers was the establishment of a world economy based on an extremely unequal division of labor between European states and the rest of the system. Also, in the interest of early European capitalists, was the establishment of strong European states that had the political and military power to enforce this inequality. The modern economy based on globalized capitalism was formed, and the global power hierarchy between the European colonizers and the rest of the world was set. Wallerstein divides the capitalist world economy into three areas: peripheral areas, semi-peripheral areas, and core states. The peripheral areas are the least developed. They are exploited by the core for their cheap labor, their raw materials, and agricultural production and land resources. An example of a peripheral state would be Bangladesh, where much of the world's textiles are now manufactured. The semi-peripheral areas are somewhat intermediary jurisdictions. They are both exploited by the core, but also have a role in the exploitation of peripheral areas. Indeed, recently, they have been expanding their manufacturing activities, particularly in products that the core nations no longer find very profitable, such as textiles and clothing manufacturing. Examples of semi-peripheral states would be Brazil and Mexico. Core states are the most exploitative. They exploit both the peripheral and semi-peripheral areas to sustain high qualities of life. In recent history, core states are in geographically advantaged areas of the world, most notably in Europe and North America. These core states promote capital accumulation internally through tax policies, government purchasing, sponsorship of technology, research and development, financing infrastructure development in the form of sewers, roads, public transportation, airports, which are most often privately constructed but publicly financed, and maintaining social order to, in a perfect world, minimize class struggle and thus conflict. Core states also promote capital accumulation in the world economy itself. They want even the peripheral and semi-peripheral areas to operate in the capitalist economy that fuels those power relations. These states have the political, economic, and military power to enforce unequal rates of exchange between the core and the periphery. This is what sociologists call imperialism. Imperialism is the exercise of political and economic control by one state over another, often by military means. Developing countries are often the target of imperialistic and exploitative activities that stifle their own development and concentrate resources and labor for the profits of advanced capitalist countries. It is this imperialist power that allows core states, for example, to dump unsafe goods like chemicals, carbon emissions, or garbage in peripheral nations. It allows them to pay lower prices for raw materials than would be possible in a free and open market. It allows them to exploit the periphery for cheap labor, dump in their environment, abuse and harm their consumers and their workforce, erect trade barriers and embargoes, and establish and enforce patents, something that has become a key political conflict, particularly in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic and the global vaccine distribution. It is the economic, political, and military power of the core that allows significant capital to be accumulated into the hands of the few. In other words, that power is what creates the world system that produces and maintains the gross economic and political inequalities within and between nations. It creates social conflict. In your read, watch, and respond, please answer the following questions. What is world system theory? How does world system theory and imperialism explain international conflict? The chapter also emphasizes the challenges in defining war and distinguishes the characteristics of war, terrorism, political protest, revolution, and rebellion. War can perhaps be best defined as a conflict between two or more states through their armed forces, for the purposes of overpowering each other and imposing such conditions of peace as the victor pleases. Since the Second World War and the formation of the United Nations, however, war is a very technical term with a strong international meaning. In an effort to force nations to resolve issues without warfare, the framers of the United Nations Charter attempted to commit member nations to using warfare only under limited circumstances, particularly for defensive purposes. Since World War II, formal declarations have been relatively rare. While we often hear the term war used by politicians and in mass media, in actuality, it's rare to see countries formally declare war. For example, Operation Enduring Freedom, or what has been termed the War on Terror in Afghanistan, was never a formal declaration of war, nor was Operation Iraqi Freedom. Instead, we often see military interventions not being formally declared and therefore less forcefully subject to international laws and governing rules of war. We've also seen an increased use of what is called a proxy war in the post-Cold War world. A proxy war is an armed conflict between two states or non-state actor which act on the instigation or on behalf of other parties that are not directly involved in the conflict. For example, the Syrian war beginning in 2011 has been called a proxy war between the United States and Russia by a number of sociologists of war. There is often a muddy line between war or military intervention and armed or unarmed political protest and civil disobedience. Political protest is an organized public demonstration in which a group expresses strong objections to an official policy or course of action. Often, but not always, political protests are stimulated or informed by larger social movements. Social movements are broad social alliances of people who seek to affect or block an aspect of social change within a society. They may be informally organized at first, but in time they often turn into formal organizations, such as political parties or labor unions. These groups, parties, or unions use various forms of action, from protest to civil disobedience to even some forms of collective violence in their demands for change, which can range from policy changes or changes in working or living conditions all the way up to full revolution. Indeed, political protests and social movements do sometimes increase the likelihood of collective violence, which is often organized by a group of individuals or a social movement, and is a type of violence that is used to promote an agenda or to resist an oppressive other. When political protests or social movements move beyond nonviolent civil disobedience and public protest and into the realm of collective violence, this is when their actions become labeled as something more than just protest. Over the past 30 years, and accelerated after the tragic events of September 11th, we have seen a number of new legislative frameworks passed in many countries that introduce terrorism as a legal element that can be criminalized within liberal democracies. When groups who have a political objective engage in violent activities, many countries now have the legal framework in place to label those activities as quote-unquote terrorism. Although there is no single definition of terrorism, the textbook defines it as any act by an individual or group that is intended to undermine the lawful authority of a government or a state. But I would like you to watch the video that accompanies this video on the sociology of terrorism, where I talk about the problems with defining the concepts, particularly from a legal standpoint. In addition, the chapter discusses genocide, which is the deliberate, systematic, and planned destruction of an entire national, ethnic, racial, or political group, and how this is an example of perhaps the most atrocious war crime. The chapter describes both how war crimes are prosecuted, as well as the challenges in this system. So you should understand how war crimes are dealt with by an international globalized criminal justice system that includes various actors, like the United Nations, the International Criminal Court, and policing agencies such as Interpol and Europol. There are a variety of sociological approaches that work to help us understand globalization and global conflict, including warfare and terrorism in a globalized society. Structural functionalists maintain that global inequality serves the purpose of pushing developing nations towards modernization. The prospect of economic prosperity is thought to offer so called developing nations an incentive to abandon their so called traditional values in favor of capitalist values of a globalized world system. Modernization is thought to improve social and political institutions in developing nations, helping them become self sustaining. Since all elements in society are interrelated for structural functionalists, war and terrorism reinforce group identity and increase social cohesion as well as conformity. So as you can see, and likely are seeing as an emerging trend, structural functionalism is sometimes characterized as an incredibly patronizing theory that firmly promotes status quo power relations of advanced capitalism without critiquing any of its problems. Conflict theorists hold that wealthy nations use their financial and political domination to control and exploit developing nations for their own benefit in a world system. Money and resources flow from the developing nations' local economies back into developed nations, and these developing nations have little political power on the international stage, which reinforces their economic dependency. Conflict and change are features of social life everywhere because that is a byproduct of capitalist accumulation. War and terrorism reflect struggles between opposing groups over political issues, limited resources, or ideology domination. Only some groups benefit, namely wealthy countries, politicians, corporations, and people who profit, intermediaries, and black marketeers. In other words, the political economy of war favors a small group of already wealthy people. Symbolic interactionism, by contrast, is a micro-sociological approach that holds that communication technology has spread across the globe and to some extent redefined how we interact and share meaning. Local stories, ideologies, and cultures are often distorted by new internet technology in order to fit powerful Western scripts. The meaning of poverty is subjective, and this has implications for how people in so called developing and developed nations understand their experiences. Socialization and labeling shape attitudes and the roles people adopt towards war and conflict. In times of war, leaders use propaganda and euphemistic language to legitimize combat and reduce the national and emotional impact of death. Feminist theories hold that globalization encourages economic practices that often cause disproportionate harm to women. Recall the idea of the feminization of poverty from earlier in the term. Women's experiences will differ, however, based on factors such as their socioeconomic position, race, nationality, sexuality, education level, and ability status. For feminists, most theories of globalization devalue the importance of care work, which is predominantly fulfilled by women and often compensated far less than other skills. In liberal democratic culture, men have most often fought in wars. War is approached by feminists as misguided protective chivalry and paternalistic patriarchal sexism targeting women, indigenous, and LGBTQI2+ communities. The consequences of numerous wars between men have resulted in massive epidemics of sexual assault and violent abuses and harm against women, indigenous, and LGBTQI2+ communities. Finally, social constructivists maintain that globalization discourse reinforces existing power structures of advanced capitalism. Powerful nations use globalization discourse and language associated with globalization to make themselves appear less morally culpable when serving their self-interests at the expense of developing nations. Propaganda legitimizes war and diminishes the rational and emotional impact of death resulting from conflict. Political parties and governments deflect criticism by focusing national attention on real or imagined enemies, on the valor of a nation's fighting forces, and on the quote-unquote good they are doing in a country that has been invaded. Think of the ways in which the war on terror was framed by Western media, as the West's so-called freeing women, children, and others from the so-called barbaric grasps of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. According to social constructivists, this happens in all wars. So that's it for today. please do not forget to watch the accompanying lecture that introduces you to the sociology of terrorism. That video is also on the OWL landing page for topic 7. I hope you learned something about globalization and global inequality, war, and terrorism. This has been Professor Silva, and I'll catch you on the next episode of Social Problems.